Good evening, all. My name is Upasna Goswami. Today, I'll going to present difference between Elizabethan age and Victorian age. This is my personal information. Introduction about Elizabethan age. It has been a pretty frequently observed that perhaps Elizabethan literature does not by any means cannot literature produced in Queen Elizabeth regain and in that regain only of the most characteristic Elizabethan literature was written in the religious of James everyone Shakespeare great tragedies was written after a queen's death. Elizabethan age was extremely complex. Further, that its literature is the greatest our country has produced. Both perhaps are a quick true. But if we go on a Shakespeare as a golden age. Introduction about Victorian era. Victorians were in love with nature history. David Allen described their passion as a series of craze over geology, over Shelley, and our friends as in a petri domain. To cite just a few examples, Len Marius, on the other hand, declines a more compressive culture romance and extending over many years. The romance with nature certainly cut across a class and a gender uh, ba- barriers. Stone Cutter, Hug Miller could lose himself. Romance, passion, and love are, I believe, the right words here, and not just fancial X X generations. Victorian era was most of written in a naturalistic poem and love based poem, and then we can see he written society Victorian way most of written in the society, and then you can see Elizabethan age. Elizabethan age most of written in love, nature, and so many so many things, and then Victorian era was written in sensibility of our human life. Merrill's books, The Romance of Victorian Nature History, deliberately drawn its a romantic title from those of Victorian books themselves. Louisa and Meredith, 1836, The Romance of a Nature, On the Flower Season, illustrated, and Phillips Henry Gossen's The Romance of a Natural History, to name just two. This is that of a characteristics of the Elizabethan age and the Victorian age. This is a picture of a difference between Elizabethan era and Victorian era. There question marks so more different in even right side is a picture of Elizabethan era, and when left side is a picture of a costume of Victorian era. We can see that how different with cloth and their society. Then we gathering second both picture is gathering on a Victorian era and Elizabethan era. Culture and writing style in Elizabethan era. People in the Elizabethan era believed marrying for a love was a silly and a fanciful. However, Elizabethan England had it's a fun time to game like a chess and backgammon were popular, as were sports such as archery. Fencing is the days were frequent both as a religious party practice and by royal decrees. Society was based on a satire, social structure, and ensure everyone knew their place. For a main class is the nobility. Second one the gentry. The third one is the yeomanry, and the fourth one is the poor. In Elizabethan was a no, written in a poor class society and the nobility of our humanity. Poverty was mostly considered to be the individual fault in the Elizabethan age. Religious religious life and culture in Victorian era. Victorian England was not a religious taken as a whole Victorian literature. Make this obvious by the time one reaches Meredith and Henry James. There was a religious England within the larger society, but institu- institutionalized Christianity remained fixed in the anti-modernist positions from which the liberal uh, Protestants failed to the lure his contemporary on the con- uh, content. Similar attitudes had a more obvious political resist. Victorian society was organized hierarchically with race, religion, regoing and occupation as aspects of identity and main organization's principle of a Victorian society were gender and class. Victorian era was written in a society, class, and principle of a gender, and most of the written in feminism of the Victorian era, written in Victorian era. He was a Victorian era was a uh, more more popular than Elizabeth, and we can see the way Victorian era was a focus on the feminism, and he their stability. Women in more educated in a Victorian era. So Victorian era was popular than Elizabethan era. Here my conclusion that Elizabethan England was a society based on a religious nationalism that became a success under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and also serving as an outlet for Shakespeare and his creative work. As we can see, during the Victorian era, many changes took place. Women were able to vote, work, and have a better education. The growth of a population caused for more jobs to be opened, and eventually child labor was vanished. Uh, Difference between Elizabeth and where I was written in so many things like nature, love, and poetry. Then you can see that Victorian era was written in feminism. Victorian era woman was more able, and Elizabethan era was so many works are men are poor and poor, written in poor lifestyle. But then you can see Victorian era, poor child laborness and poorness were vanished. You cannot then more are educated and capable to our society. Uh, this is my cited work.